Today, all Western European countries have hate speech laws. This started in 2008 when the European Union adopted a framework decision on combating racism and xenophobia, and this obliged all member states to criminalize certain forms of hate speech. On the other side of the Atlantic, we have the United States, and its Supreme Court has gradually increased and consolidated the protection of hate speech under the First Amendment. So we notice two schools of thought emerging. One is the European school of thought that dictates that an individual simply speaking his mind under certain conditions can be considered a danger to society and thus should be punished by law, and the American school of thought that considers that the simple act of speaking is not a danger. However, if an individual does commit an action which is criminal in nature and it's motivated on prejudice, targeting people of a certain social group or race, then it will be considered a hate crime. So, in conclusion, when it comes to prejudice, the European school of thought punishes thought, while the American school of thought punishes action. So in order to understand why this difference of opinion occurred, we need to go back in history and look at how the hate speech laws came to be. Because the origins of these laws seems to be rather forgotten, as they are not being taught in schools, nor do we see it mentioned in the mainstream media. So as I mentioned before, hate speech laws are quite a recent addition. The United States and the vast majority of European and Western states were originally opposed to the internationalization of hate speech laws. European states and the United States shared the view that human rights should protect rather than limit freedom of expression. Rather, the introduction of hate speech prohibition into international law was championed in its heyday by the Soviet Union and its allies. During the Cold War, the United States and its allies fought against the Soviets and their allies, both an economic war, a scientific war, and at the same time a cultural war. What was interesting about the exchange of culture and ideas was that the USSR was a locked state. No Western publication or Western idea could penetrate the Iron Curtain. Meanwhile, Soviet university professors, Soviet students, as well as Soviet journalists could go into Western countries and spread their ideology openly, whether it was in universities, in newspapers, or even on national television. One of the problems that these Soviet propagandists faced was the fact that they were being challenged. As such, the creation of hate speech laws, or if it wasn't possible, the creation of a culture of political correctness, would create a labyrinth for the speaker challenging communist ideals to have to navigate through. Failure to properly navigate this labyrinth would lead to either social ostracization or, at worst, a fine from the government. This would definitely benefit the communist speakers as they would get less and less people challenging them, as well as using hate speech as a political weapon to go back into the past and see what a person has said previously. And if they had said anything considered of hate speech, it would lead to the ostracization of that person from the public life. If you want recent examples of this, look at the definition of Islamophobia that is sponsored by Google. The mere dislike of Islam is considered Islamophobic, and in certain nations in Europe, it is a criminal activity to be Islamophobic, and it can lead to fines or getting ostracized from social media by having your account banned. Now, imagine you're an atheist and you're challenging a member of the Islamic faith on a theological debate. How are you going to go around doing so without being viewed as disliking Islam and therefore being an Islamophobe? How many people are even going to have the courage to have such a debate in front of a massive audience, knowing what the punishment is for being branded an Islamophobe? And finally, who is going to have the advantage in such a debate where one person can simply speak their mind freely and openly, while the other person has to constantly be absolutely sure that he's not stepping on eggshells? He has to constantly make sure that every sentence he is saying can't be misinterpreted, and has to be very certain that the arguments he is using aren't too problematic. So the concept of criminalizing hate, of implementing hate speech laws, or of imposing a culture of political correctness is not about making sure we don't offend people, because Western nations already had that covered through the code of manners. No, the idea of implementing political correctness and hate speech laws is as a political weapon that would have benefited at the time the Soviet Union. And later on, the people in power who can define on a whim what is considered politically correct and what isn't. Now, going back in time, as the different schools of thought in Western Europe and the United States were deciding if and how they should implement hate speech laws, another party comes to the table. This party is represented by the Organization of the Islamic Conference. And since 1999, they tried to push for the defamation of religions and Islamophobia to be included under hate speech. It's interesting to point out that while the European states and the United States would have gone through different ways of trying to implement these hate speech laws with good intentions, the initial proponents were anything but well-intended. The Western acceptance of hate speech laws severely limits the ability of liberal democracies to counter attempts to broaden the scope of hate speech laws under international human rights law, with potentially devastating consequences for the preservation of free speech. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is adopted. And this declaration does not include an explicit duty to prohibit hate speech. The Article 19 simply secures freedom of opinion and expression. However, the drafting history shows that the issues of hate speech regulations and restrictions on free speech were indeed frequently discussed. During the negotiation of Article 19, the drafters faced the challenge of whether, and if so, to what extent freedom of expression should tolerate even intolerance. And yet again, we see the United States championing free speech. Their proposal read, "There shall be freedom of speech, of the press, and of expression by any means whatsoever." However, the Soviet Union continuously proposed various amendments aimed at prohibiting expressions of intolerance. The first UK proposal on the wording of an article aimed at securing freedom of expression recognized, like the Soviet proposal, the possibility for states to limit this right of free speech in the interest of national security, against incitement to violence and disorder and obscene publications, whereas the United Kingdom proposal expressed doubts about the possibility of including publications aimed at suppressing human rights, but the UK recognized a danger that, and I quote, "these words would afford a wider power for the limitation of freedom of publication than is necessary or desirable." Throughout the negotiation, the Soviet Union constantly tried to push for amendments with the goal of limiting the spread of fascism. Their efforts to restrict Article 19 were rejected in the Third Committee, as several Western and even non-Western countries worried that fascism, which the Soviet proposal aimed to prohibit, could not be defined. The Soviet delegate dismissed these doubts and explained that fascism could be defined as the bloody dictatorship of the most reactionary section of capitalism and monopolies. The UDHR should guard against the fascists existing in all European countries except the quote-unquote people democracies, which they referred as communist countries, being an exception. As pointed out by John Morsing, this highly politicized perspective clearly demonstrated that the Soviet proposal would be targeted not just at Nazism, but also against agitation in favor of capitalism and liberal democracy, and in all likelihood against any other political ideology than the supposed real democracy of communism. When it came for the drafting of Article 7, the Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and the Protection of Minorities, yet again we see the Soviet Union presenting a proposal that included an obligation to prohibit, and I quote, any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hostility, or of national exclusiveness or hatred and contempt, as well as any action establishing a privilege or a discrimination based on distinctions of race, nationality, or religion, constitutes a crime and shall be punished under the law of the state. The United States and the Belgian experts vociferously opposed the proposal and sought to prevent a vote on it. However, France came up with an extensive proposal requiring states to punish infringements of the principle of non-discrimination. Ultimately, it was Australia and China which presented a draft compromise provisions that sought to condemn only incitement to violence against minorities, which was then adopted with 10 votes and 1 abstention in the subcommission. However, this was not enough for the Soviet delegate, which continued to fight for limiting freedom of expression in the working group of the Human Rights Commission. The Soviet delegate held a speech in which he declared that without the prohibition against hate speech, any declaration would be useless. This led to a reiteration of the above-mentioned Soviet proposal on Article 7, which was yet again rejected, though very narrowly this time, with 2 votes to 2 and 2 abstentions. During the second session of the Human Rights Commission, the Soviet delegate tried once more to submit the proposal, and this time the Belgian representative took it into consideration. He rejected the Soviet proposal, but amended the current version of Article 7 with the praise and against any incitement to such discrimination, which was then adopted with a great majority. Now, in the third session of the Human Rights Commission, the British and Indian delegates jointly proposed to delete the prohibition against incitement to discrimination, since the United Kingdom, feeling morally bound to carry out the provision of the declaration, would be obliged to pass laws which experience had shown were neither necessary nor desirable. Countries supporting the British-Indian stand included the United States, while the French representative strongly favored a prohibition against incitement to discrimination, and he was joined by inter alia, the delegation from Yugoslavia, who felt that incitement to discrimination should be expressly forbidden. Now, as we move to Article 4, we notice that the Soviet and the Polish proposal wanted to prohibit and disband racist, fascists, and any other organization practicing or inciting racial discrimination. In line with this, Czechoslovakia proposed prohibiting dissemination of ideas and doctrine based on racial superiority or hatred. This time, the United Kingdom expressed support to the threshold envisaged by the US proposal, since speech should be free, but incitement to violence should be repressed. A number of other delegations, primarily Western, made similar statements, but the most eloquent opposition to Article 4 came from the Colombian representative, who stated that Article 4 is a throwback to the past. Punishing ideas, whatever they may be, is to aid and abet tyranny and leads to the abuse of power. As far as we are concerned, and as far as democracy is concerned, ideas should be fought with ideas, and reasoned theories must be refuted by arguments and not by the scaffold of prison, exile, confiscation, or fines. These views were countered by statements primarily from representatives of communist countries, such as Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, arguing that the prohibition against discrimination, even among private parties, should be given preference over freedom of expression. Now, I could go on and talk about how the Soviets wanted to criminalize stereotyping, how freedom of expression was supposed to be limited, and many other restrictions that we have to free speech and freedom of expression were firstly proposed by the Soviets, but I do want to keep this video short. Clearly, most contemporary proponents of hate speech laws do not share the same ideologies and methods as the communist states of the day. Yet they seldom mention or reflect upon the fact that such laws, and even the concept of hate speech, were proposed and advocated for by anti-democratic states in which freedom of expression, as well as all other basic human rights, were routinely violated. Nor do they mention that these states, often totalitarian, had a clear interest in legitimizing and justifying their repression with the use of human rights language. A good example of this absurdity is the former Yugoslavia, which is the scene of the latest European genocide, a state very active in promoting a prohibition against hate speech at the United Nations. In Article 134 of the Criminal Code in force at the time of the breakup of the Social Federalist Republic of Yugoslavia, punished with imprisonment of up to 10 years anyone who incites or fans national, racial, or religious hatred or discord between people and its nationalities. The article was mostly used by the communist regime to silence critics, but the prohibition against hate speech obviously did nothing to inculcate a culture of tolerance that could prevent ethnic cleansing and genocide, which occurred throughout Yugoslavia's breakup. Because what's interesting to point out is that back then, in these types of nations, the law would only be applied on the detractors of the communists, but whenever the communists would break the law or they would cause violations of the law, it was overlooked, ignored, and the law would only be applied against the communist detractors. So I hope you enjoyed this video, which was an interesting trip to the past, and I hope I managed to bring up some new information to the table. If you like these types of videos and if you like my channel, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment down below.